Hello, this is Matthew Gordon from the University of Missouri. In this presentation, I want to give you a brief overview of regional differences in British English. Well, really just English, since we'll be focused only on England. My emphasis here is on historical connections. As we'll see, many of the dialect differences we observe today can be traced to patterns we've discussed in studying the history of English. I want to begin with a very simple kind of overview question: why are there dialect differences at all? The basic explanation is something like this. A language change happens in some community. They begin to use a new word or a new pronunciation, something like that. And that innovation doesn't spread to other communities, which creates a linguistic difference across those communities. Of course, we want to ask why a change might fail to spread, and actually this is part of asking why changes normally do spread. The key here is communication. If people from different communities are in regular contact, then they might influence each other linguistically as well as in terms of other aspects of culture. So if one community starts pronouncing a vowel in a new way, the communities with which they're in contact might pick up on that pronunciation, and eventually that innovation might spread throughout all, or at least most, speakers of the language. But if communication is hampered, if the people from place A don't have a chance to talk to the people from place B, then there's less of an opportunity for them to influence each other. When we think about what kinds of things would serve as barriers to communication, probably the first things that come to mind are physical. Geographic barriers like mountains or seas or even large rivers. But there are lots of social divisions that work just as well to limit communication across groups. And certainly social class works this way. And in many societies, factors like religion or ethnicity or even gender might have similar effects. A quick word about the relationship of regional and social dialects to this variety that we call Standard English. People are often quick to assume that the standard language preserves historical forms, and in this way it represents a more conservative version of English. The corollary to this thinking is the belief that non-standard dialects, that they somehow arise by people making mistakes or changing or ruining the proper form of language, right? And this is obviously part of the standard language ideology that's covered previously, lesson 13 for those of you taking the online version of this course. This way of thinking has really little support in actual fact. As we'll see here, many of the differences between regional dialects and standard English stem from changes that happen in the latter, while the dialects are the ones that preserve earlier forms. A great example of this would be the use of multiple negation, or what's commonly known as double negatives, as in, I didn't say nothing. As you may remember, this was the normal pattern in Old English and in Middle English, and the forms with single negatives, which are the ones that we consider standard today, forms like I didn't say anything or I said nothing, those actually came from changes that took place in early modern English, so they're the more recent innovation. And this is not to say that regional and social dialects do not also innovate, they certainly do, but the linguistic forms that distinguish them from standard English are not always the result of such changes. Now I'll turn to look at some examples of regional dialect differences in England. As it happens, there's quite a lot of variation of this type. In a way, that might seem unexpected given the size of the country. England is really not that large a country, no offense, right? But size-wise, it's actually comparable to the state of Missouri. In fact, Missouri is a little bit bigger in terms of square miles. Still, the speech differences that we hear in England are much greater than any we can find across Missouri. It's really hard for non-experts to hear any dialect difference between someone from Kansas City and someone from St. Louis. I mean, unless you happen to bring up Panera in some way. And yet those cities are separated by some 250 miles. If we take that same distance and translate it to England, well, even an untrained American ear can clearly distinguish the voice of someone from London from that of a Geordie, which is the name for people from Newcastle in the far north of England. Again, about 250, 300 miles from England or from London. The reason that the regional differences in British English are much greater than in American English is really time. People have been speaking English in England for some 1,500 years, and that's a lot longer than they've been speaking it in Missouri or anywhere else in the United States. And as a result, that's allowed for lots of changes and innovations to develop, and for some of them to spread across communities while others didn't spread, and those became markers of local dialects, following the pattern discussed earlier. Let's dig in with some examples. So begin with a very simple example. This map here from work by linguist Peter Trudgill shows differences in what are called children's truce terms. This is the category when kids are playing a game and they want to pause in the game, they want to ask for clarification, or maybe they have to run to the bathroom or tie their shoes or something like that. It's this sort of thing. We might use something like timeout or times in American English. As you can see, there's a wide variety of forms used in British English, everything from words like keys and barley in the north to things like phainates and scribs in Cree and cruciates in the south. Right? But you might say, well, okay, of course there's going to be differences in children's vocabulary. Kids, they make up words all the time. Maybe that's going to explain why there's lots of regional differences. Surely there would not be differences in very, very basic grammatical forms. Here you see a comparable map, again from Trudgill's work, showing differences in the form of the first person singular verb form of the verb to be, the form that in standard English is am. So I'm not the only one, am I? And you can see am is widespread across many parts of England, but there are alternatives. In some parts of England they might say is I, or bin I, or be I, or are I. Right? So lots of variation there, even in this very basic vocabulary word. This gives a kind of summary of the regional dialects in English, again attributed here to Peter Trudgill. And you can see there's essentially a three-way distinction. You have this broad area of the south with lots of subdivisions there. Then you have this middle area, which is labeled here the central, but is often called the Midlands. And then in the north you have the northern dialects. Again, lots of subdivisions there, but a basic three-way division across. We turn now to looking at some more particular forms of regional differences in English. English, again, with an eye on their historical connections. Right? We're using these regional forms as a kind of window into the history of English, or maybe by contrast using our knowledge of the history of English as a window into the regional variation we see. We'll begin here with this map, which shows a distinction between the words child, which is widespread across much of the south of England, and the alternative word for child, bairn. Bairn is a word that is borrowed from Old Norse, so this is a result of contact with the Vikings toward the end of the Old English period. It survives in present-day Norwegian, because Norwegian is derived from Old Norse, the language that the Vikings, the Danes, spoke. So you can see this variation here, and not surprisingly, the Old Norse form bairn is common in the northeast part of England, where the Viking influence was the strongest. Similar type of example here, where we see the verb to play in some parts of the northeast of England has the form to lake, which again, this is a borrowing from Old Norse, survives in present-day Norwegian in a comparable form, and it is there because that was the area of Viking influence. So our knowledge of the history of this contact between speakers of Old Norse, the Vikings or the Danes, and speakers of Old English helps us understand why some of these forms were preserved in regional dialects of English today. We also see variation in terms of pronoun usage. So as we know, there have been lots of changes in the pronouns in English over the course of its history, and you can see some of this variation here. So forms like thou and thee, which we thought had died out after Shakespeare's day, are still preserved in some regional dialects, as are older forms like ye, which is a traditionally distinct form from the form you, which is the standard form we use today. So lots of traces of historical forms in regional dialects today. Just a couple of more examples along those lines. Here's a little line that shows the pronoun who when I put little Sally to bed. Who cried? This from Lancashire. And who there is the third person singular feminine form, standard English she. We might think, well, why would they use the word who for this? But if we remember the historical forms here, the Old English form of this pronoun was heo, that derived in some dialects of Middle English as ho, and that comes out as who today, right? So we have a direct line from the Old English form to the form we see in this dialect of Lancashire today. Similar kind of example in North Staffordshire, we can see older verb and pronoun forms. So this is one of the areas where the might be used as a pronoun meaning you, and you have forms like asked instead of have, or kust instead of could. And of course that st on the end of these verbs is the modern derivative of the older st second person singular agreement form. So in early modern English, these might have been something like thou hast or thou couldst, right? The st as a marker of the second person survives in these regional grammar forms. A couple of examples of pronunciation to round out this discussion. What we find, one trend in English is that the North tends to be much more conservative than the South. And so we often find older forms preserved in Northern dialects. So for example here, we see some variation in the pronunciation of the vowel in a word like night, which in most of the south of England is pronounced as I, just as we do in American English, but in some parts of the north of England they might pronounce it with an E, so they would say neat instead of night. And that might seem rather peculiar until you remember, oh, the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift, in fact, before the Great Vowel Shift in Middle English, this vowel was indeed E for everyone, so everyone would have pronounced night as neat, and it's only as a result of the Great Vowel Shift that that vowel became shifted from an E to an I. Clearly, though, that Great Vowel Shift did not take place everywhere, and the older form is preserved in some dialects of the North. Similar story here with the word long, which is pronounced as lange in some conservative northern dialects. Two things going on here. We have the vowel difference. That's the original Old English vowel. If you went to look up this word in Old English, you'd see it had an ah there. It became an open O in Middle English. That's a little bit of history that we learned earlier. But then also we have the preservation of the original nga, the nasal plus the ga consonant at the end of the word, which have smushed together into a single consonant in Standard English and in dialects of American English, but it's preserved there. This one, of course, is maybe a little bit more familiar because it's preserved in the song that's traditionally sung on New Year's Eve, Auld Lang Syne. The lang is, in fact, this older Scottish or Northern English pronunciation of the word long. One final example is the treatment of short U. You might remember that in early modern English, short U split into two different phonemes. So it was originally an sound, so the conjunction but might sound like but originally in early modern English, for example, and then in many dialects that was lowered to a schwa-like sound that we use today, but in the north of England it's preserved with the original short U vowel, so but sounds like but, right, and sun sounds like sun, and so forth, right. Unlike some of the other ones, this is a distinction that is still quite widespread. Some of the other ones you'd only find in maybe in lots of older, more conservative speakers of the language, but this is quite widespread in many even younger speakers of English in the north of England today. So with those few examples, I hope you can see the importance of studying regional dialect forms and how the examination of such forms is really aided, boosted by our knowledge of the history of English. So many pronunciations and grammatical forms and even different words may seem bizarre when we first encounter them, but often we can explain their origins by considering the historical context.